Welcome. There is nothing pressing. Whatever the day left behind, it can wait until morning, and morning is a long way off, which is exactly as it should be. Right now there is only this voice and this subject, and we are going to move through it slowly and without any hurry at all, because this is that kind of story. Tonight we are going to talk about desert caravans, not the romantic version, not the dramatic version with dunes at sunset and the mystery of the horizon. We are going to talk about what it was actually like, the daily reality, the hours of walking, the weight of the load, the specific discomforts, the small routines and the waiting, and the quiet, ordinary texture of a life spent moving through the desert with camels and goods and other people. We are going to take our time. Let us begin before the caravan has even set out. A caravan in the great desert trading routes of the ancient and medieval world, the Silk Road, the Trans-Saharan routes, the incense, roads of Arabia, the routes across the Iranian plateau, did not simply appear one morning and depart. It assembled. The assembly of a caravan was a process of days or weeks in which individual merchants and their goods and their animals gradually gathered in the departure city until there were enough to make the journey worthwhile and safe. Safety was the primary reason for the caravan system. The desert was dangerous. It was dangerous from thirst and heat and the disorientation of featureless terrain. It was also dangerous from bandits, who preyed on solitary travellers and small groups, but were less likely to attack a large, well-organised column of merchants with armed guards. The caravan pooled the security of numbers against both the human and the natural dangers of the desert. The gathering of the caravan happened in the caravanserais, the large inns that existed specifically to serve the needs of long-distance merchants. The caravanserai was a substantial building, usually square or rectangular, with a large central courtyard where animals could be kept and watered and fed, surrounded by covered arcades that gave shelter to the merchants and their goods. The rooms were small but protected from the elements, which was the primary requirement. A caravanserai in a major trading city like Samarkand or Bukhara or Cairo might be a permanent building of some grandeur, with domed rooms and decorated tilework and reliable water from a cistern or a well. A caravanserai at a stopping point in the desert might be a more modest affair. 4 walls, a roof of some kind, a water source, and little else. But both served the same function, a protected stopping place where merchants could rest and store their goods, and where information could be exchanged about the route ahead. The merchants who assembled at the caravanserai came with different goods and different destinations. A spice merchant from the Persian Gulf might be travelling to Damascus. A cloth merchant from Damascus might be going the other direction, toward the east. A merchant trading in sub-Saharan goods might be heading north toward the Mediterranean coast. A merchant carrying Chinese silk might be going as far as the Byzantine Empire, or might sell to an intermediary here who would carry it further. All of these people needed to travel in the same direction for some or all of their route, and the caravan was the vehicle for this collective journey. The leader of the caravan leader, or in Arabic, the kafilabashi, was a person of considerable responsibility. He organised the departure, decided the route, managed the pace and the stopping schedule, resolved disputes among the merchants and the camel drivers, negotiated with the water sellers and the guides and the local authorities at each stop. He was paid for this service. sometimes a flat fee, sometimes a percentage of the value of the goods travelling under his organisation, a good caravan leader was worth a great deal. His knowledge of the route, the water sources, the safe stopping places, the time of year to travel and the time of year to avoid, was specialist knowledge that could mean the difference between a successful journey and a catastrophic one. Routes across the Sahara or the Arabian Peninsula had water sources separated by days of travel, and missing a water source was potentially fatal. The caravan leader who knew where the water was and could find it in terrain that all looked the same to the inexperienced eye was providing an essentially irreplaceable service. The water sources determined the route, not the shortest path, not the most direct line between 2 points, but the path that connected water to water at intervals that camels and people could manage. The geometry of the caravan route was the geometry of survival, shaped by the placement of wells and springs and oases across the desert. Let us now think about the camels. The camel was the technology that made desert trade possible. No other animal could carry significant loads across the desert at the pace required for long-distance trade. Horses needed much more water than camels and tired more quickly in heat. Donkeys were useful over shorter distances but lacked the endurance for the great crossings. The camel, specifically the dromedary camel of Arabia and North Africa, and the Bactrian camel of the Central Asian steppes, was specifically adapted to desert conditions in ways that made it almost miraculous as a beast of burden. The camel's ability to go without water for extended periods is real, but often misunderstood. A camel in cool weather, not working hard, can go a week or more without water. A camel in summer heat, carrying a heavy load and walking many miles per day, needs water much more frequently, perhaps every 3 or 4 days. But even this reduced requirement was far better than any other animal of comparable load-carrying capacity. The camel stored fat, not water, in its hump. The hump was a reserve of energy, and a camel that was worked hard and fed poorly would have a smaller, softer, less erect hump than a well-maintained animal. The experienced camel handler watched the hump carefully as an indicator of the animal's condition. The loading of a camel was a skilled and time-consuming task. The load had to be balanced exactly. An uneven load that put more weight on one side than the other was uncomfortable for the camel, and over time produced sores and injuries on the uneven side. The standard loads for a working dromedary in good condition range between 200 and 300 kilograms, depending on the animal and the terrain. The goods were packed in specific containers designed for camel transport. Large sacks of grain or salt were balanced in pairs across the camel's back. Ceramic vessels were cushioned in straw within wooden frames. Metal goods were wrapped and secured. Cloth was baled and wrapped against the dust. The wrapping and cushioning of goods against the motion of the camel, the rolling, swaying gait that was efficient for the animal but hard on fragile cargo, was a constant practical challenge. The camel's gait, the rolling walk that moved both legs on the same side simultaneously rather than diagonally as horses and most quadrupeds move, was distinctive and was the source of seasickness-like discomfort for inexperienced riders. Experienced riders adjusted to it, as experienced sailors adjusted to the motion of the ship. But for the first days on a camel, the motion was noticeable in the stomach. Most caravan participants did not ride camels, most walked. The camels carried the goods and perhaps the elderly or sick members of the party and the small children. The merchants, the camel drivers, the guards, the servants, they walked. Let us think about the walking. A caravan in the desert typically covered between 20 and 30 miles per day on a good day in reasonable conditions. This distance was determined by the pace of the loaded camels, which was not fast, perhaps 3 miles per hour, and the number of hours of walking per day, which was typically 6 to 8 hours, with rest at midday when the heat was most intense. 20 to 30 miles of walking per day through sand and rock and dust in heat is significant. It is not a casual stroll. The feet at the end of such a day were tired in a specific settled way, the kind of tiredness that settles into the bones of the leg and the tendons of the ankle from hours of walking over uneven terrain. The terrain of the desert was not uniform. The popular image of the desert as an endless sea of smooth sand dunes was not always accurate. Many of the great caravan routes crossed terrain that was rocky rather than sandy. The Hamada, the flat rocky desert of the Sahara, was in some ways harder going than sand dunes because the rocks were irregular and sharp and required constant attention to foot placement. Sandy terrain, when it came, was soft and yielding, which was tiring in a different way. Every step sank slightly, requiring more effort to lift the foot for the next step. The feet of a caravan participant were protected by sandals, typically. Simple leather sandals with a thick sole. For the rougher terrain, more protective footwear was worn. The sandal was always somewhat insufficient against the heat of the sand surface, which in direct sun could reach temperatures that would burn unprotected skin in minutes. The experienced desert traveller walked on the edge of the foot, or learned the quick, light step that minimized contact time with the hot surface. The clothing of the desert caravan was specific and practical. The general principle, covering most of the body despite the heat, was counterintuitive to people from cooler climates but correct for desert conditions. Exposed skin in direct desert sun was skin that burned and dried and became painful. The covering of the body in loose cloth held a layer of air next to the skin that modulated the heat and protected against the direct radiation of the sun. The headcloth, the keffiyeh or shemagh or tagelmus depending on the culture and the region, was the most important garment. It protected the head and the neck and could be wrapped around the face in sandstorms, leaving only the eyes visible. The ability to wrap the face completely against blowing sand was a critical function in a desert where sandstorms were a genuine hazard. The sandstorm was one of the most dramatic and most feared of desert experiences. The approach of a sandstorm was visible, a dark wall on the horizon, brown or reddish, moving toward you with a speed that left less time to prepare than it seemed. The preparation was, find whatever shelter was available, wrap the face, protect the eyes, crouch down, and wait. The storm arrived. The air became opaque with sand. The sound was a roar and a hiss simultaneously, this sand hitting every surface, making a collective sound unlike anything else. The visibility dropped to nothing. You could not see your own hand at arm's length in a severe storm. The sand found every gap in your clothing. It found the gap between your shima and your face. It found its way into your mouth if you opened it, into your ears, under your eyelids. The camels knelt and closed their nostrils and their double eyelids and waited with the patient endurance that was one of their most valuable qualities. The humans crouched near the camels or against their loads and waited. The storm lasted an hour, or several hours, or a day. When it passed, the landscape was altered. The dunes had moved. The familiar landmarks were buried or reshaped. The trail was covered. The caravan leader, if they were good, oriented from the position of the sun or the stars and found the route again. Let us now think about what happened when the caravan stopped. The caravan did not travel at night in most traditions because navigating by night in the desert was difficult and because the camels needed rest. The stopping time was typically in the late afternoon or early evening, when enough light remained to set up camp but when the worst of the day's heat had passed. The stopping of the caravan was a choreography that became routine after the first day. The camels were brought to kneel, an operation requiring command and the pulling of a lead rope at the right angle, the camel folding its legs in the distinctive sequence that kneeling camels use, the animal grumbling in the way that camels grumbled at almost everything. The loads were removed and stacked. The camels were hobbled, their front legs loosely tied together to prevent them from wandering, and let to graze if there was any vegetation, or fed from the carried feed if there was not. The feed for the camels was part of the caravan's load, a significant weight of grain or dried vegetation or pressed cakes of fodder that was consumed steadily through the journey. Managing the camel feed, ensuring there was enough without carrying more than necessary, which added weight to the loads, was part of the daily calculation of the caravan. Water for the camels was the other major calculation. When the caravan reached a water source, the camels were watered before anything else. The priority of the animals over the people was not a sentimental preference, but a practical one. Without the camels, the goods did not move and the people might not survive. The camel that died of thirst was a loss both immediate, the load it carried now needed redistributing, and long-term, because camels were expensive and replacing them was not simple. The camp, once established, was a temporary settlement of considerable organisation. Tents were pitched, the low, dark tents of the desert nomads, made from woven goat or camel hair that was heavy to carry but effective at managing heat, keeping the interior cooler than the ambient temperature because the tight weave stopped direct airflow while allowing some evaporation of moisture. The tent was low and required sitting or lying inside rather than standing, but it was shade, and shade in the desert was its own form of comfort. The fire was lit. The fire in the desert camp served multiple purposes: cooking, warmth in the cold desert night, and the light that made the camp feel like a place, rather than merely a stop in empty terrain. Desert nights were cold. The same landscape that baked under a noon sun could drop to near freezing temperatures after dark, because the dry desert air retained almost no heat. The transition from the heat of the day to the cold of the night was sharp and swift, and the fire was the response. Wood for the fire was gathered or brought. In some parts of the desert, enough dead vegetation, dried shrubs, dried camel dung, dried anything, was available to fuel a fire. In those completely barren sections, fuel had to be carried, which was another weight calculation. The cooking on the desert campfire was simple. The desert caravan diet was determined by what could be carried, which meant dried dates, dried figs, dried meat, dried beans and lentils, rice where it was available, bread in the form of flatbreads that could be made from flour and water on a griddle over the fire, and the staple of the desert traveller across many cultures, the cup of hot, strongly sweet tea or coffee that bookended each day. The making of tea was one of the most consistent rituals of the desert camp. The water was heated, the tea was added, the sugar was added in large quantities by modern standards. The tea was poured and reheated and poured again, the brewing process a matter of some pride and some tradition. In the Saharan tradition, the tea ceremony involved 3 glasses. The first very strong and bitter, said to be like life, which was strong. The second slightly sweet, said to be like love. The third very sweet and mild, said to be like death, which was gentle. 3 glasses, drunk in succession, over a period perhaps of an hour, the ceremony of the tea as much social as nutritional. The tea was the pivot of the day's end and the day's beginning. In the evening, the tea gathered the participants of the caravan around the fire. In the morning, before the loading began, the tea was the first warmth of the day. Let us now think about the people of the caravan in more detail. A caravan was not a uniform group. It contained people of various social and economic positions, various ethnicities, various religions, various purposes. The wealthy merchant might have his own tent and his own servants and his own supply of better food and water than the common camel driver had. The travelling scholar, using the caravan for safety on a journey to study with a distant teacher, had different needs and different habits than the cloth trader who had made this route 20 times. The religious diversity of a caravan on the Great Silk Road or the Trans-Saharan routes was remarkable by the standards of most fixed communities. In the same caravan, you might find Muslim merchants from Persia, Jewish merchants from Cairo, Christian merchants from Armenia, Buddhist pilgrims from Central Asia, Hindu merchants from India. The caravan, as a practical institution, had to function despite this diversity, and largely it did. The common interest in arriving safely and profitably was a unifying force. Whatever your religion or your origin, you wanted the caravan to move efficiently, to reach its water sources, to avoid bandits, to arrive at its destination with the goods intact. This common interest produced a working tolerance that was sometimes more genuine than the stated tolerances of fixed communities. There were also the specialists who travelled with caravans without being merchants themselves, the water guide, the person who knew the desert and its water sources, who could navigate in terrain that all looked the same, whose skill was the specialist knowledge of the desert itself. The physician, some larger caravans had a physician, which was practically important given the distances from any fixed medical help. The storyteller, whose services were valued for managing the morale of people who were tired and a long way from home. Let us now think about the night in the desert, after the tea, after the meal, after the conversation had wound down and the fire had been reduced to coals. The camp settled into sleep. The tents were occupied. The people who preferred to sleep outside lay on their bedrolls under the open sky, wrapped in their blankets against the cold. The desert night sky was extraordinary. The desert air was dry and clear, no moisture, no haze, no clouds on most nights. The stars were vivid in a way that the humid air of the coast never produced. The Milky Way was not a pale suggestion, but a bright structured band of light. The stars were the desert's map for those who knew how to read them. The sounds of the desert night were specific. The camels hobbled nearby, moved occasionally, a heavy body shifting, the jingle of a chain, the soft moan that camels made at no particular provocation. The fire settled into itself with occasional small sounds. Sometimes in the distance the sound of something that might have been an animal or might have been the wind in the rocks. The cold was real. Not the mild cool of a temperate night, but the sharp cold of a dry desert night, the temperature having dropped dramatically from the day. The blankets were pulled close. People lay in pairs or groups for shared warmth, pragmatically indifferent to the social niceties that would have governed sleeping arrangements in a fixed settlement. Sleep in the desert caravan came quickly, because the day's walking produced genuine tiredness, the kind of tiredness that the body settles into without resistance, where consciousness goes without much effort. The cold of the desert night accelerated sleep. You got under the blanket and your body, which had been working for hours, did what it needed to do. The middle of the desert night was quiet in a way that few other places achieved. No traffic, no animals of any kind in the most barren stretches, no water, no wind if the night was calm. The silence of the deep desert at night was a profound silence, the kind that has a quality of its own, a thickness, a completeness. It was the presence of silence, active, settled, the silence of a space that did not require sound. The desert as a place of spiritual retreat, the tradition of the mystic going into the desert for solitude and purification, was not merely a religious metaphor. It was a real response to the desert's specific qualities. The silence was real. The absence of distraction was real. The stripping away of everything non-essential that the desert forced on you, the reduction of life to its bare necessities of water and food and shelter and movement, was a real experience with real effects on the way you thought. For the caravan merchant, the desert was simply the route between markets. But even for the merchant, the weeks in the desert produced a particular kind of clarity that the town did not. The simplicity of the desert day, walk, rest, water, eat, sleep, with its profound reduction of options, had a settling effect on the mind that the complexity of the city did not produce. Let us now think about the oasis. The oasis was the destination, or the stopping point, or the goal that organized the day's walking. The approach to an oasis was a specific experience. You saw it from a distance, if the terrain permitted, a dark smudge of green in the pale brown landscape, palm trees visible, their distinctive silhouette unmistakable. Or you smelled it before you saw it, the smell of water and vegetation, so different from the dry, minerally smell of the desert that it was immediately recognizable and immediately welcome. The palm trees of the oasis were the most reliable indicator of water. The date palm needed a great deal of water, but could find it at depth in the desert soil, its roots going down to the water table. Where date palms grew, there was water below, and often a well or a spring at the surface. The arrival at an oasis was one of the genuine pleasures of the caravan journey. Not a dramatic pleasure, not a sudden reversal of fortune, but a settling relief. The end of the day's walking, the prospect of water, the shade of the palms, the sight of settled life after days of the empty desert. The trees were tall and their shade was imperfect. Palm fronds did not make a complete canopy, but the filtered light under a grove of date palms was cooler than the open desert sun, and the sense of enclosure and green was a relief to eyes that had spent days looking at sand and rock and sky. The water at the oasis well was drawn by hand, or by an animal-powered lifting device, a wheel to which ropes were attached, the ropes turning the wheel as the animal walked in a circle lifting leather buckets from the depths of the well. The sound of the wheel and the creak of the buckets and the splash of water at the surface was the sound of the oasis, as characteristic as the silence of the desert was the sound of the desert. The dates were available. Dates were among the most important foods of the desert, for both the caravan and the oasis population. The date palm produced abundantly in the desert environment, and the date, when dried, kept for months or years. The date's sweetness was valued in a diet that was otherwise not particularly sweet. The concentrated sugar of a handful of dried dates was immediate energy and immediate pleasure after hours of walking. The oasis market was small by comparison with the markets of the trading cities, but it was a market, and the arrival of a caravan was an event for the market. The caravan brought goods from the outside world, news, textiles, metal objects, spices, and the oasis had to offer in return dates, grain, local goods, and most importantly, fresh supplies of food and water for the continuing journey. Let us now think about the specific goods that the caravan carried. The goods of the great caravan routes were, for most of their history, luxury goods, items that were valuable relative to their weight and bulk, because the cost of transporting them across thousands of miles of desert required that value. Silk from China was the perfect caravan cargo, light in weight relative to its value, resistant to the desert environment if properly packed, and in demand throughout the Mediterranean world. Spices were similarly ideal, small volumes, high value, durable if kept dry. Pepper from India, cinnamon from Sri Lanka, cloves from the Maluku Islands. These spices travelled overland and overseas for months or years before reaching the markets, where they commanded prices that made the long journey economical. Gold and silver moved through the caravan routes in both directions, West African gold moving north across the Sahara to the Mediterranean world, silver moving south and east. The concentration of wealth in small volume made precious metals ideal caravan cargo. Salt was one of the most important bulk commodities of the desert trade, less glamorous than silk or spices, but fundamental to the daily lives of millions of people who did not live near a salt source. The great salt mines of the Sahara produced slabs of rock salt that were cut into standard blocks and loaded onto camels and transported south to the agricultural zones of West Africa, where salt was rare and therefore extraordinarily valuable. The logic of this value is straightforward. Where salt is necessary and unavailable, it commands whatever price the buyer can pay. The agricultural communities south of the Sahara needed salt for food preservation, and for their own bodies and for their animals, and the only source was the desert mines far to the north. The caravan was the only means of distribution. Let us now think about navigation in the desert. The desert did not have roads in the modern sense. It had routes, paths of travel that were defined by the locations of water sources, by the nature of the terrain, by the passage of previous travellers. In sandy terrain, these routes were invisible. The sand covered all tracks within a day, leaving no trace of the thousands of people who had passed. In rocky terrain, the tracks of caravans were worn into the stone, visible for centuries. The caravan leader navigated by the stars at night and by the sun during the day, by the general direction of the prevailing winds, by specific landmarks, a particular rock formation, a distant mountain, a bend in a dry riverbed. The camel itself was a navigation tool. Camels knew water. If you loosened the leading rope of a camel that had been this way before, in the vicinity of a water source it had visited, it would walk toward the water. Whether this was smell or memory or some other sense was not known, but it was real, and it was used. The lost caravan, the caravan that had missed its water source, was a genuinely terrifying possibility. The desert held the bones of lost caravans in the sand, the dried remains of camels and people who had miscalculated or been caught by an unexpected sandstorm that had covered the landmarks. These bones were a reminder to current travellers of the cost of navigational failure. Let us now think about what the desert did to people over the days and weeks of a long crossing. The desert produced a particular physical state in the people who crossed it. The dehydration that even careful water management allowed was constant and low level. You were never fully hydrated in the way you would be in a place with unrestricted access to water. The lips dried and cracked, the skin dried and tightened, the eyes were dry. The sun's effect on the skin was significant over a long crossing. Even well-covered skin was exposed at the face, and the desert sun at altitude and in dry, clear air was intense. The skin darkened and toughened. The eyes, accustomed to the constant brightness, developed a permanent narrowed squint that desert people maintained even in dim light. The feet were in a constant state of minor injury from the walking. Blisters formed and healed and reformed. The skin of the soul thickened over weeks of walking on rough terrain. The mind, over weeks of desert crossing, simplified. The reduction of stimulation. No novelty in the landscape, no variation in the daily routine. The same sequence of walking and resting and eating and sleeping repeated without change, produced a simplification of thought that was experienced as either oppressive or liberating, depending on the person. Some caravan travellers found the simplification oppressive. The mind had nothing to feed on. The days blurred together. The sense of time passing became strange. Others found it liberating. The mind, stripped of the usual complexity of urban life, settled into a simpler mode. The immediate, the sensory, the present moment, the weight of the load underfoot, the temperature of the air, the direction of the sun, these became more vivid as the usual mental clutter receded. This is one of the oldest accounts of what we would now call mindfulness, arrived at involuntarily through the conditions of the desert. The desert forced simplicity on you. Whether that simplicity was pleasant or not depended on your capacity for it. The merchants who made the same route many times developed a familiarity with the desert that was its own kind of relationship. They knew this part of the desert the way they knew a road they had travelled daily for years, not with the alert attention of the first crossing, but with the comfortable habituation of deep familiarity. This familiarity expressed itself in small things. The recognition of a specific rock formation from 50 trips ago. The knowledge that this particular stretch of route was harder on the camel's feet. The anticipation of the oasis over the next ridge. Not hope, exactly, because hope implies uncertainty, but the settled expectation of a known thing. Now let us think about the caravanserai at the end of a long desert crossing. The entry into a major trading city after weeks in the desert was an arrival. The city was large and noisy and smelled of all the things that a large city smelled of, which after the sterile dryness of the desert was complex and overwhelming. The senses, which had been somewhat dulled by the desert's limited stimulation, were suddenly engaged by everything at once. The caravanserai room was small, and the food was simple and the bed was harder than you wished. But it was indoors. It was shelter. The walls were stone or brick and not canvas. The floor was not sand. The temperature regulated by the thick walls was neither the blazing heat of the desert noon nor the sharp cold of the desert night. It was just warm and still and enclosed, and this, after weeks in the desert, was enough. Let us now slow down and move very quietly through some more details. The leather of the camel saddle at the end of a long day's ride had absorbed the heat and the sweat of the day, and was warm and slightly soft. The leather of the water gourd was cool if you had managed your water supply well, and the gourd was nearly full. It was uncomfortably light if the supply was running low. The rope that was used to tie the caravan loads was hemp, or fibres from the dome palm where hemp was unavailable. These ropes were maintained carefully. A rope that broke under a load could cause the load to shift and injure the camel. You checked your ropes in the morning, before loading, and again in the evening when you unloaded. You replaced sections that were fraying. The candles or oil lamps that lit the evening camp were lit sparingly. Oil was heavy to carry, and every pound of oil was a pound not available for tradable goods. The fire gave most of the evening light, and the fire was let to die down early to conserve fuel. The darkness of the desert camp when the fire was out, and no moon was above the horizon, was a very complete darkness. Urban people who experience darkness only at the failure of artificial lighting are not accustomed to the kind of darkness in which you cannot see your own hand. Desert darkness in the new moon phase was that kind of darkness. You navigated the camp by memory if you needed to get up in the night. The arrangement of the tents and the sleeping places and the camel lines was known, and you moved through the known spaces by the knowledge of the body. The stars in such darkness were the only light. This sky was what was lit, not the ground. And under that lit sky, in the cold, in the silence, the caravan slept. The people from many places and many backgrounds, speaking many languages and praying in different ways, all sleeping in the same cold and silence under the same stars. The merchants and the camel drivers and the guides and the guards and the scholars and the pilgrims, all of them in the desert, all of them sleeping, as you are sleeping, or becoming so, in the warmth that the desert night did not have, in the quiet that the desert night did have, in the place where you are, under whatever sky is above you. The fire is out, the camels are settled, the loads are stacked, the distance travelled today has been travelled. The distance remaining will be travelled tomorrow, but tonight is for rest, and rest is here, and the silence is here, and the stars are above, wherever the sky is clear, as they were above the caravan, turning slowly in their ancient patterns. Sleep now. The desert is quiet. Good night. For those still walking, if you're still awake, the caravan is still moving. Come and walk alongside for a while. The afternoon walk was the hardest part of the day. The morning walk was begun fresh, the night's rest still in the body, the temperature still manageable. The midday rest had given the body a partial recovery, but the afternoon walk was done on a body already tired from the morning, in heat that had been building since dawn, with the destination still some distance ahead. The feet knew the walk. They had been doing it for days. They found their rhythm without instruction, the step of the desert walker, slightly shorter than a normal stride to reduce the impact on the feet over the long distances, the slight forward lean that minimized the energy cost of each step, the arms swinging as a pendulum to assist the rhythm. This was an economical walk, not comfortable, not leisurely, uncomfortable and tiring, but efficient. The desert traveller's body, over the weeks of a long crossing, learned to minimize the energy expended per mile. The body became lean, the movement became more efficient, the waste was removed slowly by the daily miles. The people of the caravan walked in different places within the column. The caravan leader was typically at the front. The senior merchants followed. The camel drivers walked alongside their animals. The guards were positioned at the sides and the rear. Within these positions, the walking fell into a pattern. You walked with the people you knew, or the people you had come to know over the days of the journey. You talked, or you did not talk, as the conditions and the energy and the inclination allowed. In the late afternoon, talking was less common. The energy for talk had been used earlier in the day. The body was focused on the mechanics of walking, on the rhythm, on the management of the diminishing energy reserves. The walk was more inward in the late afternoon. Each person somewhat alone in the effort of continuing, the collective momentum of the caravan the only thing that kept each individual moving. And then finally the leading edge of the column slowed. The caravan leader had chosen the stopping place. The signal went back along the column. The camels were directed to the right and the left, spreading into the camp arrangement. The loads came down. The evening began. This is the moment we have been walking toward. Not a dramatic moment. Not an arrival at a destination. Simply the end of another day's walking. The beginning of another evening in camp. The next in a series of evenings that had begun at the departure city and would end at the destination city, and in between were simply evenings in the desert. The fire is being lit, the water is being heated for tea, the camels are being hobbled, the tents are going up, and the sun is going down as it has gone down every evening of the crossing in the desert colours that are different from the city colours, more red, more orange, more vivid for the dryness of the air and the flatness of the terrain that lets you see the entire arc of the sunset at once. The colours fade, the stars come, the tea is poured, and the evening begins its slow wind down. And you are here, in the camp, in the quiet, at the end of the day's walking, with the walking done, and the night here, and sleep here. Good night. The weight of the load. Every person in the caravan carried something. Even those who had nothing else to carry carried themselves, and the body in the desert was a weight that had to be managed like any other load. Fed, watered, rested, kept moving at a sustainable pace. But most people carried more than themselves. The camel driver, who was not at that moment leading a camel, carried a pack with his personal goods. The merchant who was riding part of the day walked part of it, and when he walked he might carry a small pack. The weight of a load was felt differently at different times of the day. In the morning, fresh from rest, a load of 20 or 30 pounds was manageable. By midday the same load was heavier, not physically heavier, but perceived as heavier, because the body was tired and the muscles were beginning to register the sustained effort. By late afternoon the same load was very heavy indeed. This is the illusion of fatigue. It makes the constant feel like an increase. The load that was manageable becomes difficult, not because the load has changed, but because the capacity to carry it has been reduced by hours of use. The experienced caravan traveller knew this and managed it. You did not think about the weight of the load in the late afternoon. You thought about the next step and the one after that and nothing further. The technique of the long-distance walker is the technique of present moment focus. This step, this breath, this small increment of the total distance. The total distance considered as a whole is paralyzing. The next step considered alone is simple, and now the weight is set down, the load is off. The body that has been carrying it can feel the absence of the weight, a lightness that is a relief after the hours of carrying. Set down whatever you have been carrying, the load of the day, the weight of the things that have not been resolved, and the things that need to be done, and the things that should have been done differently. Set it down. It can be picked up again tomorrow. For now, the pack is on the ground, the body is light, the desert is quiet, the fire is warm, and sleep is here. Good night. The stars over the desert. The stars over the desert were, as we have said, extraordinary. But let us spend a little more time with them. The navigator who used them professionally saw them as information. The bearing of this star, the declination of that one, the position of the Pleiades on the horizon telling the experienced either season and direction. The poet who crossed the desert saw them as something else. The great poets of the Arabic tradition, and Arabic literature is full of the desert, because the desert was the landscape that formed the culture, found in the stars a language for what was beyond ordinary language. The desert night sky was the image of vastness, of the smallness of the human, of the eternity that contained the brief human life. The merchant saw them as something more practical. After the day's walking, the stars were the ceiling of his rest. He lay on his back and the stars were there overhead, as they were always there. Not remarkable anymore after weeks of seeing them. Simply the sky. Each person saw the same stars and found in them what they brought to the looking. As you look at whatever ceiling is above you, or close your eyes to whatever you see when you look inward, you find in that looking what you bring to it. Tonight, bring rest. Bring the intention of sleep. Bring the willingness to let the day's walking be done. The stars are overhead somewhere, above whatever clouds or roofs separate you from them, turning in their slow patterns, the same patterns they turned in above the desert caravan, above the merchant in his tent, above the camel driver on his bedroll, above the pilgrim on the long road to wherever the pilgrim was going. The stars do not know any of this. They simply are, as you are, in the night. Good night. The end of the crossing. Let us now describe the end of the crossing, the arrival at the destination city, the completion of the journey. The last days before a major trading city were not like the earlier days. The terrain changed. The desert gave way gradually to the margins. The steppe, or the scrubland, or the agricultural zone where irrigation brought water to the land, and the land supported crops and animals in numbers the deep desert could not. The world became gradually more inhabited. Villages appeared. The smell of dung and cooking and irrigation water was the smell of the inhabited world resuming after the desert's sterility. The road became more defined. The ruts of many carts and wagons and animals were visible, the accumulated passage of traffic shaping a clear path. Other travellers appeared, individual riders and small groups of travellers, the traffic of the city's hinterland, all moving toward the same destination, and then, on a morning or an afternoon, the city. First the walls, the massive walls of an ancient trading city visible from a long way off, the towers and gates rising above the surrounding landscape. Then the sound, the generalized noise of a large population going about its business, audible from a surprising distance, and the smell, complex, layered, the smell of a city after weeks of the desert's clean dryness. The caravanserai was found. The loads were brought down for the last time on this journey, and the caravan was done. The months of preparation, and the weeks of walking, and the days of heat, and the cold nights, and the sandstorms, and the bad water, and the weight of the loads, and the silence of the desert. All of it behind you now. The goods were here. You were here. The journey was complete. In the evening of the arrival day, before the business properly began, there was a meal. Better than the desert food. Fresh bread, fresh vegetables or fresh fruit, depending on the season and the place. The specific foods of this specific city, different from the foods of the departure city and different from the desert food, and therefore welcome as variety is always welcome after sameness, and after the meal, sleep, in a room with walls, in a room not subject to the cold of the desert night, on a surface that did not shift with the wind, in the shelter of the city, after the desert. This sleep, this first night's sleep in the city at the end of the crossing, was one of the deepest sleeps available to the caravan merchant. The body that had been sleeping in the desert for weeks, in the cold, on the hard ground, with the ears always somewhat alert for the sounds of the night, now lay down in shelter and warmth, and found the sleep that had always been somewhat incomplete in the desert and slept completely. As you can sleep now, completely, in the shelter of wherever you are, after whatever journey today has been. The desert is behind you, the city is here, the walls are around you, the night is safe, and sleep is complete and available and waiting. Take it. Good night. The caravan at rest. The caravan at rest was a different thing from the caravan in motion. In motion it was a line, a progression, a direction and a purpose and a momentum. Each part connected to the next by the logic of the route and the pace and the shared destination. At rest, it spread out. The camels were in their lines, the tents were positioned in a rough arrangement, the fires were distributed through the camp. The line dissolved into a cluster, the cluster into a settlement, temporary but real, and within that temporary settlement, the ordinary life of the people resumed. The merchant wrote in his account book, noting the day's progress and the current state of his goods. The camel driver examined his animal's feet for the sores and abrasions that accumulated over days of walking on rough terrain. The cook worked at the fire. The guards talked quietly at the edge of the camp. The evening settled. The fires went low, the talking stopped. The breathing of the camp changed from the varied breathing of many people doing many things to the slower, deeper breathing of many people asleep or almost asleep. The desert took back the darkness. The stars were steady overhead. The camels breathed and occasionally moved in their hobbles with the sound of chains. The camp was at rest, as you are at rest. Or going to rest. Right now, in the quiet of wherever you are. After the day's walking, after whatever the day's journey has been, the fires are low, the loads are set down, the camels are settled, the desert is quiet, and the stars are overhead, and sleep is here. Deep, complete, sufficient sleep, the sleep of the caravan at the end of a long day's walking, the sleep of arrival, the sleep of rest earned. Take it. Good night. The sound of the desert. We have talked about the silence of the desert, but let us be more precise because the desert was not entirely without sound. The silence of the desert was the absence of the sounds of civilization. No engines, no crowds, no music from neighbouring houses, no traffic, none of the perpetual human noise that modern people are so accustomed to they do not hear it until it stops. What remained in that absence was something quieter and more specific. The sound of the wind when it moved, which in the desert was sometimes a whisper and sometimes a roar, and often nothing at all. The sound of sand moving. A fine dry susurration when the wind picked up a layer of loose sand from a dune surface and carried it a few feet before setting it down again. The sound of a camel shifting its weight, or breathing deeply, or making the particular low groan that camels emitted with such frequency and apparent lack of reason. And at night sometimes the sound of a fennec fox, the small, large-eared fox of the Sahara, calling in the dark a long way off, or the sound of a desert bird, brief and unlikely in the stillness, or the sound of nothing, which is the sound that remains when all of these have stopped. These sounds were the sounds of the desert itself, not the sounds of things passing through it. They were the sounds of the place, not the sounds of the people, and sleeping in the middle of these sounds, the occasional wind, the distant animal, the shifting camel, and long stretches of the pure nothing, was sleeping inside the desert, inside the landscape, as much part of it as the sand and the rocks. The caravan traveller who had been out long enough stopped experiencing the desert as a context and started experiencing it as a place, the place where they were, their place for now. The specific quality of each night's stopping place became part of the memory of the journey. This night on the rocky plateau where the wind came from the northwest, that night in the hollow where the sand was deep and soft and the sheltered spot was warm even after the fire went out. The night near the dry riverbed where something had disturbed the camels and they had been restless, their chains sounding through the stock. Each night was its own night, not interchangeable, each one specific, known in the particular way of a body that had lain down in that specific place and felt that specific ground and heard those specific sounds. These nights accumulated into the memory of the crossing, the detailed sensory record of having been in this desert in these specific places at these specific times. Your nights accumulate the same way, each night its own night, each night specific, and this night tonight is one of them, specific, yours, in the quiet, in the warmth that is your warmth, in the familiar sounds of your own place. This night, this specific night, after this specific day, sleep now, good night. The camel at rest. The camel at rest in the evening camp knelt with its legs folded beneath it, its body close to the warm ground, its long neck extended forward, with its head resting on the sand or the rock, or raised and looking around with the mild, slightly disdainful expression that camels maintained in all circumstances. The camel did not seem to enjoy resting in the demonstrative way that a dog rests, the visible collapse into comfort, the sighing. The camel rested as the camel did everything, which was without great expression, in the consistent mode of an animal that accepted its circumstances without notably approving or objecting to them. But the camel at rest was genuinely at rest. The respiration slowed, the large dark eyes half closed, the ears went still. The body, which had been in motion for hours, stopped its motion and became a warm breathing shape in the cooling evening. The camel driver who had been managing this animal for weeks knew its rest as he knew its work, from long observation. He knew when this particular camel was settled for the night and when it was not. He knew its specific patterns of rest, its preferences, its habits. This knowledge was the knowledge of long attention, the knowledge that comes from being with something or someone for a long time, paying attention because it mattered. The camel rested, and beside it, the camel driver also rested, and the desert rested around both of them, as it has rested for millions of years, before the camels and before the camel drivers and before the trade routes and before all the history we have been discussing. The desert was there before all of it, and it will be there after, and in its long rest, in its long unchanging patience, it receives the caravan and the camels and the merchants, and lets them pass, and is the same after they have passed as it was before. This is the desert, and this is the rest it offers, the absolute rest of a place that does not need anything from you. That simply is, around you, quiet, patient, old, and in that oldness, in that patience, you can rest too, as small as the caravan in the vast desert, as temporary as the night's camp in a permanent landscape, and as rested when the morning comes as the desert that has been here forever. Sleep now in the desert's patience, in the long quiet of the place that does not need anything from you. Good night. The daily rhythm. The daily rhythm of the caravan, once established, had a regularity that was one of its most characteristic features. The first sound of the day was the call to prayer, if the caravan included Muslim merchants and travellers, which it almost always did on the Great Arabian and Trans-Saharan routes. The muezzin's call, or simply a voice raised in the pre-dawn dark calling irrelevant words, brought the praying members of the caravan to their feet before the sky had lightened. The others woke to the sounds of the camp coming to life around them, the movement of the camels as they were prepared for loading, the voices of the drivers calling to each other, the sound of the fire being stirred into life for the morning tea. The morning tea was not elaborate. Water boiled, tea added, sugar added in quantity, poured into whatever cup or glass was available, drunk while standing or crouching near the fire, hands around the warm vessel. The body that had been cold from the night appreciated the hot, sweet liquid in the most immediate and uncomplicated way. The flatbreads, if there were flatbreads this morning, were made quickly on the griddle. A thin disk of dough pressed onto the hot metal, cooked for a few minutes on each side, eaten immediately while still warm, with dried dates, with a little oil if oil was available and not too precious to spend on breakfast. This was not a long meal. The day's walking needed to begin early, before the worst of the heat arrived, and the time from waking to departure was managed efficiently. The loading of the camels began before there was full light. The camels were brought to stand, which they did with grumbling protest as always, and the loads were lifted and balanced and secured. The ropes were checked and tightened. The leader walked the length of the caravan, checking each animal and each load, and then the caravan moved. The first step of the day, the first step of what would be another 20 or 25 or 30 miles of walking, taken in the grey light before sunrise on the same terrain they had been crossing for days. The first hour of walking was often the best hour. The air was cool, the body was rested, the tea was still warm in the stomach, the light was coming, the sky lightening in the east, the stars fading, the horizon sharpening. Then the sun rose, and the day's work began in earnest. This was the morning, and the morning was followed by the midday, and the midday by the afternoon, and the afternoon by the stopping, and the stopping by the evening, and the evening by the night. And the night was for rest, and the rest was for the morning, and the morning was for walking. This was the rhythm, reliable as the sun, predictable as the desert, and in its predictability, in its reliability, in its steady repetition of the same sequence through the days of the crossing, there was something that could be rested in. You knew what was coming. Not the specific terrain, not the specific weather, not the specific events of the day, but the structure. The morning tea, the loading, the walking, the midday rest, the afternoon walking, the stopping, the evening tea, the fire, the sleep. This structure repeated, and you moved within it, and the days passed, and the distance accumulated, and the destination approached. The structure held you. You did not have to decide what the day would look like. It looked the same as yesterday. You knew what to do. And now the structure holds you here. The structure of the night, which follows the day, which requires the same thing the caravan's night required. Rest. Simply rest. Nothing more complicated. The day is done. The evening is done. The tea has been drunk. The fire is low. And the structure holds you. And the structure says, sleep. Good night. The last fire. The last fire of the evening was the fire that had been burning since sunset, now reduced to a small cluster of coals in the centre of the ash. It gave little light now. The camp was in darkness except for the orange glow of the coals and the stars above. The people who had been sitting near the fire earlier had gone to their places. The conversation that had accompanied the fire's brighter hours had stopped. Only the coals remained, still warm, still giving off a faint heat that you would feel if you sat close, cooling slowly toward the temperature of the surrounding air. Coals are patient. They hold their heat for a long time after the flames have died. They are the stored warmth of the wood that burned, slowly released into the night air, available to whoever sits near enough to receive it. The caravan traveller who woke in the middle of the night, from cold, from a sound, from the ordinary stirring of sleep, and found the fire reduced to coals, could see the orange glow from their bedroll. The coals were still there. The fire had not gone out. In the morning it could be brought back with a breath and some new wood. The thread of warmth had not been broken. This was reassuring in the small way that small things are reassuring at 3 in the morning in the cold desert. The coals were there. Something was still keeping watch. Something was still warm. You pulled the blanket closer and went back to sleep. The coals cooled. The night continued, and in the morning the fire came back, as it always came back, as the morning always came back. As everything that was needed always came back in the desert, in the caravan, in the rhythm of the crossing, as sleep will come back to you, right now, in the dark, in the warmth of wherever you are. With the coals of the day still glowing somewhere in the warmth you are carrying. The fire is low, but it has not gone out, and the morning will come, but not yet. For now, the coals, and the quiet, and the night, and the blanket pulled close. Sleep now. The fire knows what it is doing. Good night. The patience of the desert. The desert was patient in a way that living things were not. The sand did not hurry. The rock did not hurry. The distance between water sources did not hurry. The desert waited, as it had always waited, for the people who crossed it to do what they needed to do, to walk their miles, to drink their water, to rest in their camps. and it received whatever they left behind and eventually covered it with sand or bleached it with sun. The caravan was temporary, the desert was permanent. This asymmetry shaped everything about the desert crossing, and the experienced desert traveller understood it without necessarily articulating it. You were a visitor. The desert was the host, and the host had been there long before you and would be there long after. This understanding, the understanding of your own temporariness in relation to the landscape, was one of the gifts of the desert. It was not a comfortable gift exactly, but it was clarifying. The things that seemed urgent in the city, the social negotiations, the commercial pressures, the accumulated obligations, did not seem urgent in the desert. The desert reduced urgency to its essentials: water, food, direction, pace. Everything else was available to wait. The merchants who made the crossing many times carried this clarity back with them to the city. Not permanently, the city reasserted its urgencies quickly, but for a time after arrival, the desert traveller saw the city's urgencies with a slight detachment that came from weeks of having moved through a landscape indifferent to all of it. The deserter's teacher was a recurrent image in the traditions of the cultures that lived near it and crossed it. Not a comfortable teacher, not a gentle one, but one whose lessons were simple and clear, delivered through the daily reality of heat and thirst and distance and silence. The lesson of the desert was this: you're small, the world is large, what you need is simple, what you can carry is limited. What matters is water and direction and the next step. Everything else is surplus. This is a useful lesson. It is a lesson you can carry out of the desert, into the city, into the night, into this moment. You are here. The world is large. What you need right now is simple. What you can carry right now is nothing at all. Everything else can wait. The desert offers this. Tonight, in the quiet, in the patience, in the vast indifference that is somehow also a kind of kindness. The desert does not need anything from you. It simply is, and in its simply being, it frees you from the urgency, from the weight, from the accumulated load of the day. The desert holds you lightly in its enormous quiet, and the night continues, and sleep is here. Good night. The route between cities. The route between two great cities of the medieval trading world, say, between Bukhara and Samarkand, or between Timbuktu and Marrakesh, or between Alexandria and Baghdad, was not merely a physical path. It was a social institution, a cultural corridor, a thread of human connection maintained over centuries. The same routes were travelled by the same families of merchants over generations. The father brought his son on the journey, and the son learned the route, and eventually the son brought his own son, and the knowledge of the desert, the water sources, the landmarks, the safe stopping places, the dangerous stretches, passed from generation to generation along with the trade goods and the commercial relationships. The caravanserai keepers along the route knew the families. They recognized faces that returned year after year. They knew which merchant always bargained hard for the feed prices and which one accepted the standard rate without discussion. They knew who travelled with what goods in what season. This personal knowledge, the accumulated knowledge of years of encounters at the same stopping places, was a form of trust infrastructure, a network of recognized relationships that made the trade possible. A merchant travelling the route for the first time was a stranger in a network of the known. He would introduce himself through his connections, I am the son of so-and-so who traded this route for 30 years, and the name would be recognized, and the stranger would become known through the reflection of the known. This network of names and recognition was the social fabric of the caravan route. It was maintained by the reliability of the merchants who used it, by showing up every year, by honouring their agreements, by dealing fairly, and it made each subsequent journey easier and more secure because of all the journeys that had preceded it. The routes were also corridors of information. News travelled the caravan routes at the pace of the caravan, which was slow, but it travelled. A merchant arriving in Samarkand from the east brought news of the east. A merchant arriving from the west brought news of the west. The caravanserai was where this news was exchanged, where the merchants of different directions met and told each other what they had heard and seen. This information exchange was not incidental. It was one of the primary functions of the caravan system. Before telegraphs, before newspapers, before any rapid communication technology, the caravan was how the world knew what was happening beyond the horizon. The network of caravan routes was the network of information, slow but vast, connecting the known world into a single space of gradually shared knowledge. What did they talk about? The merchants exchanging news in the caravanserai. Prices primarily. The price of silk in Samarkand this season, the price of pepper in Alexandria, the political situation that was affecting the route west of such and such a city. The practical information of the trader, the information that affected decisions about what to buy and where to sell, and also the larger news, the change of ruler in a distant city, the outbreak of a plague in a province, the arrival of a fleet from an unexpected direction, the strange natural event that people were interpreting as an omen. These things also travelled the caravan route, mixed in with the commercial information, the large world present in the small exchanges of merchants at rest in a caravanserai courtyard. And now the courtyard is quiet. The merchants have gone to their rooms. The camels are settled. The city is outside the walls, and inside the caravanserai, in the room that is small but sheltered, the merchant who has just completed a long desert crossing is lying down for the first time in weeks on a surface that does not move, in a room that does not let in the desert wind, and sleep comes, as it always comes when the body is tired and the mind has nothing left that must be decided tonight, as it comes now, for you, in your room, in your shelter, in the warmth, after the day's journey, whatever it was. Good night. The water. Everything in the desert came back to water. The route was shaped by water. The pace was determined by water. The decisions of the caravan leader were driven by water. The anxiety that accompanied the crossing was, at its deepest, anxiety about water. Water in the desert was not the background given that it was in the well-watered world. It was the foreground, the constant presence in the calculation of the day. How much do we have? How far to the next source? How much are we using? What is the condition of the camels? Is there enough? These were the questions that the caravan leader was always asking, consciously or not. They were the questions that shaped the decisions. When to push on and when to rest. When to water the camels fully and when to conserve. When to seek a shortcut that might save time and water, and when to stay on the known route even if it was longer. A caravan that managed its water well completed its crossing. A caravan that did not was in danger, and in the desert danger was not theoretical. The quality of the water at different sources along the route varied considerably. The water at a well-maintained oasis well, regularly drawn and recently renewed by underground flow, was fresh and clean. The water at a seasonal pool that had been standing for weeks in the heat, visited by animals as well as by travellers, was a very different proposition. Travellers who had no choice drank whatever was available, but they knew the difference. Treating bad water was beyond the capacity of the typical caravan. Boiling required fuel, which was scarce, and other purification methods were not available. You drank what you found, and if it made you sick, it made you sick, and you kept walking if you could. The water skin or water gourd that each person carried was their personal share of the caravan's water supply, and the weight of it changed through the day as you drank. A full water skin in the morning was heavy against your side or your back. By late afternoon, if you had been drinking your rationed amount through the day, it was lighter. The lightness was a mixed feeling. The relief of having drunk enough and the anxiety of having less remaining. At the water source, the refilling of the water skins was one of the most satisfying acts of the crossing. You held the neck of the skin open, and the water came in, the skin becoming heavy again, the weight of it in your hands, the weight of safety, of another stretch of desert manageable, of the next water source reachable. Water was simple, and it was everything, as sleep is simple and it is everything at this hour, not complex, not requiring effort, simply available. Here, in the quiet, after the thirst of the day, drink it, let it fill you. The sleep that is here, available, waiting. Take it. Good night. The camel driver. Let us spend a moment with the camel driver, who was the person who made the caravan work in its most essential dimension. The caravan driver, the man or woman who walked beside the camels, who knew each animal individually, who loaded and unloaded and watered and fed, and checked the feet and treated the sores and managed the complex social dynamics of a group of camels, was not the most celebrated figure of the caravan. The merchant was the one with the money. The caravan leader was the one with the authority. The caravan driver was the one with the camels. But without the camel driver, there were no functioning camels, and without functioning camels, there was no caravan. The camel driver knew things that no one else knew. He knew that this particular animal could carry a heavier load than it looked like it could, because its muscles were denser than they appeared. He knew that this other animal was developing a sore on its left shoulder from a load that had been sitting slightly high for 3 days, and that the load needed to be repacked tonight or the animal would be in real trouble by tomorrow. He knew that the lead camel of his string, the dominant animal, the one the others followed, was nervous today, and that a nervous lead camel made the whole string nervous, and that something in the terrain or the smell of the air had unsettled it. This knowledge was not written down anywhere. It was in him, accumulated from years of working with these animals, from watching and handling and listening to them in the way that you listen to anything you pay close attention to over a long time. He had learned it from his father, perhaps, or from an older driver who had taken him on as an apprentice, and he would teach it, if he had anyone to teach, to whoever came after him in the role. The camel driver's day was longer than most. He rose earliest to begin preparing the camels for loading. He rested least at midday, because the camels also needed attention at rest. He was among the last to sleep, checking the animals one final time before lying down himself. His pay was modest. His status was low. His knowledge was irreplaceable. This combination, essential knowledge, low status, modest pay, was the lot of many of the specialists who made the ancient world function. The blacksmith who knew the metal, the sailor who knew the currents, the farmer who knew the soil, the herbalist who knew the plants. They held the world together with their specific, unglamorous expertise, and the camel driver held the caravan together. One animal at a time, one day at a time, one desert crossing at a time, and now his work is done for the day. The camels are settled, the loads are stacked, the feed is distributed, the water has been given, and the camel driver lies down on his bedroll near his animals, near enough to hear if something is wrong in the night, far enough to be out of reach of the occasional bad-tempered kick, and closes his eyes, and the camels breathe, and the desert is quiet, and the night holds everyone as it holds you, equally. Regardless of status or knowledge or specific expertise, the night holds you. Sleep now. Good night. The morning that is coming, the morning is coming, not yet. But it is coming, as it always comes, out of the east, as it has come every morning since the desert was the desert. Before it comes, the night has its full course to run, the stars complete their arc, the Pleiades move to the west, the Orion sets. The eastern sky remains dark for a long time, and then lightens, almost imperceptibly at first, and then more clearly, and then the sky above the eastern horizon is lighter than the sky above the western horizon, and the stars near the east have already faded into the brightening sky. The camels stir. They know the morning before it fully arrives. Their biological clocks are accurate in the way of animals that live by natural light, and the approach of dawn registers in them, and they begin to shift and make the preliminary sounds of animals coming out of deep rest. The caravan driver opens his eyes. The camp is still dark except for the faint lightning of the east. The fire has gone cold, the desert is very quiet. He lies for a moment, just a moment, before the day's work begins. In that moment, before the loading and the tea and the walking, there is the desert morning, the stars still visible in the west, the cold of the night, the quiet. And then he gets up, and the day begins, and the quiet is over for another day. But the morning will come again tomorrow, as it always comes, as it is coming now, on the other side of this night, a long way off, and between now and then, sleep. This night, all of it, from now until the morning, yours, in the warmth, in the quiet, under whatever stars are above you. Sleep now. The morning is coming, but the night is here first, and the night is long, and the sleep is here. Take it, all of it. Good night. The sand. Let us think about the sand in more detail, because the sand was the most constant material of the desert crossing, and it deserves more attention than it has received. Sand is not a uniform material. Desert. Sand varies by region, by the source rock from which it was weathered, by the age of the deposit, by the specific conditions of its formation. The sand of the Sahara is different in colour and grain size and texture from the sand of the Arabian desert, which is different from the sand of the Taklamakan desert in Central Asia. But all desert sand shares certain qualities. It is fine. The individual grains are small, the result of long weathering of rock into ever smaller particles. It is dry. Desert sand holds almost no moisture, and the feel of truly dry sand is the feel of something that pours like water, that flows and shifts and settles. It is pervasive. It finds every opening, works its way into every container, settles on every surface. The sand in your food was a constant of the desert crossing. Despite every precaution, despite the careful wrapping and sealing of provisions, sand found its way in. The flatbreads that were made on a griddle near the ground were sandy. The dried dates that were stored in bags were slightly sandy. The water in the gourd that you drank from, even that over the days of the crossing, accumulated fine grit that you felt rather than tasted, a slight roughness at the back of the throat. You ate the sand. There was no alternative, and after a time you did not particularly notice it. The sand in the sleeping area was a separate problem. The bedroll or the blanket spread on the ground was spread on sand, and the sand worked its way into the bedding over the night, so that in the morning the inside of the blanket had a layer of fine grit that had migrated through the outer surface. Shaking the blanket helped, partly, but the desert sand was too fine to be entirely removed by shaking, and a blanket used in the desert for a week had a gritty quality that was simply the quality of a desert blanket. The sand in your clothing followed the same logic. The garments washed in a desert camp could be washed in very limited water, and could not be rinsed properly, and the sand that got into them during washing stayed in them, drying into the weave. The undergarments of a desert traveller at the end of a long crossing had a gritty quality that was simply accepted. This is one of the more overlooked details of desert caravan life, the constant low-level presence of sand in everything. Not dramatic, not the sandstorm that blinded you and buried your trail. Just the ordinary daily sand, present in the food and the water and the clothing and the bedding and the air. The substance of the desert worked into everything, and you stopped noticing it after a time, as you stop noticing the ordinary background conditions of anywhere you are. As you have stopped noticing the ordinary background conditions of your own room, which has its own specific qualities, its own temperature, its own sounds, its own particular quality of air and light, that are invisible to you precisely because they are constant and familiar. The desert traveller stopped noticing the sand. You have stopped noticing your room. In both cases, the stopping noticing is a kind of peace. The environment is accepted, absorbed, incorporated. It is simply where you are. It is home for now. And in that acceptance, in that incorporation, the body settles. The breathing slows. The attention releases its grip on the details, and sleep becomes possible, not by achieving anything, not by resolving anything, simply by letting the sand be the sand, and the room be the room, and the night be the night. Good night. The Merchant's Account Book. The Merchant's Account Book was a record of the journey in numbers. On the right side of each page, the credits. Goods purchased, at what prices, in what quantities. On the left side, the debits. Goods sold, expenses incurred, tolls paid, water purchased, feed purchased. The running balance of each transaction and the accumulated balance of the expedition tracked day by day, from departure to return. The keeping of the account book was done in the evening after the day's transactions, by the light of whatever lamp was burning, or by the light of the fire if it was bright enough to write by. The merchant sat with his back to something, a rock, a tent wall, a loaded camel, and wrote in the small dense script of someone accustomed to fitting a great deal of information into a small space, because paper was expensive and you did not waste it. The numbers in the account book were the skeleton of the journey. They did not record the sand or the cold nights or the colour of the sunset or the sound of the camels or the quality of the water at the oasis. They recorded only the commercial facts: what was paid and what was received, what was spent and what was earned. These numbers, when the journey was complete and the merchant was back in his city and his family's house, would be checked against the expectations. Had the route been profitable? Had the goods held their value? Was the price difference between departure market and arrival market sufficient to justify the months of travel and the risk and the discomfort? If yes, the merchant was satisfied and the next journey was already being planned. If no, the calculations changed and the next journey would go somewhere else or carry different goods. This was the logic of the merchant's life, the test of the calculation against the reality, and the adjustment of the next calculation on the basis of what had been learned. The merchant in his account book was not thinking about the stars or the silence or the simplicity of the desert mind. He was thinking about the numbers, and the numbers, honestly kept and carefully calculated, were what made the entire system possible. The trade routes, the caravanserais, the accumulation of goods that made distant luxuries available to people who lived far from their source. The account book was boring in the best possible sense. It was a record of ordinary transactions, carefully noted, adding up to something larger than any single entry. A record of days, as your day has been a record of ordinary moments, carefully or carelessly noted in the account book of memory, adding up to a day that is now done. The last entry has been made, the book is closed, the tally is finished, and the night's credit is this: rest, a full night's credit of rest, available now. Good night. The horizon. In the desert, the horizon was always visible and always the same distance away. No matter how far you walked, the horizon remained at the same distance. You walked toward it, and it moved with you, maintaining its circle of desert and sky around you, always the same radius from where you stood. This unchanging horizon was one of the more psychologically interesting features of the desert. The caravan moved through the landscape, and the landscape moved with the caravan, and the horizon remained constant, and the impression was, sometimes of walking in place, of great effort expended with the world remaining the same. The experienced desert traveller understood this illusion, and was not troubled by it. Progress was measured not by the apparent movement of the horizon, but by the compass, by the stars, by the calculation of distance travelled from a known point. The horizon was irrelevant to navigation. It was simply a visual feature of the environment, no more meaningful than the colour of the sky. The inexperienced desert traveller could be troubled by it. The feeling of walking and arriving nowhere, the horizon perpetually the same, the landscape perpetually the same, the day perpetually the same, could produce a specific desert despair, in which the distance to the destination seemed not to decrease but to expand. The destination was not getting closer, it was getting further. You would never arrive. This was an illusion, produced by the featureless terrain and the unchanging horizon, and it was managed by the experienced leader in the same way that a ship's officer managed the morale of the crew during a long ocean crossing. By maintaining a routine, by marking progress, by ensuring that the days felt purposeful even when the external evidence of progress was invisible. And progress was being made. Even when it could not be seen, the miles were being covered, the days were passing, the destination was approaching. The horizon did not change, but the calculation showed the progress, and the calculation was correct, and eventually the calculation was confirmed by the appearance of the first signs of the end of the crossing. The horizon that looks the same is not the same. Progress that is invisible is still progress. The night that looks the same as last night is not the same. Sleep that comes again is not the same sleep as before. Each repetition is different in a way that matters even when it cannot be seen. This night is not the same as last night. You are further along, even when it does not feel that way. The horizon is the same, but you have moved, and the morning is closer than it was, and sleep is here, right here, in the same desert that you have always been in, which is always exactly the same distance away, and always in the end, crossed. Sleep now. Good night. The last detail. The last detail of desert caravan life that we will mention is also the smallest. At the end of each day's walking, when the loads were off and the camels were settled and the fire was lit and the tea was poured and the evening meal was done and the conversation had wound down to silence, there was a moment when the caravan traveller looked up at the sky, not specifically looking for anything, not navigating, not checking the weather, simply looking up. And the sky was there, as it was always there, with its specific content of stars and planets, and the slow movements that the practiced eye could read, and the less practiced eye simply saw as a vast and beautiful thing. And the caravan traveller, who had walked many miles and was tired and would be walking many more miles tomorrow, simply looked at the sky for a moment, and then lay down and slept. This moment, the looking up, the awareness of the vastness, the returning of the eyes to the ground and then the closing of the eyes for sleep, was not a philosophical act. It was not a spiritual practice. It was simply the last moment of the day before sleep, in the desert, under the stars. But it accumulated over many nights into something. The accumulated experience of many nights looking up at the desert sky produced a specific kind of awareness, an awareness of scale, of the smallness of the caravan in the vastness, of the regularities of the sky against the irregularities of the human journey below. You were small, the sky was large, the stars were old, the desert was patient, and you were temporary, passing through, and the passing through was what you were, doing, and it was sufficient. The last detail is the looking up, and then the closing of the eyes, and the sleep. Look up if you want, at the ceiling, at the dark, at whatever is above you, and then close your eyes and sleep. The sky is large, you are small, the night is old, and you are passing through it, which is exactly what you're supposed to be doing. Good night. The midday rest. We have mentioned the midday rest, but have not fully described it, and it deserves description because it was one of the most important features of the desert day. At midday, the caravan stopped. Not at a specific time, there were no clocks, but when the heat had reached the point where continuing to walk was both counterproductive and genuinely dangerous. This point was identified by the caravan leader using the accumulated experience of many crossings, the position of the sun, the feeling of the air, the behavior of the camels, which slowed and became reluctant in the worst of the heat. The stopping was usually in whatever shade could be found, the shade of a rock formation, the shade of a depression in the terrain that put the resting place below the direct path of the sun, the shade created by the loads themselves piled to make a windbreak and shadow. The shade was imperfect and the relief was relative rather than absolute. It was less hot in the shade than in the direct sun. That was the extent of the comfort available. The camels were not unloaded at the midday rest, usually. Unloading and reloading was a significant operation, and the midday rest was not long enough to justify it. The camels rested with their loads on, in the posture of resting camels, their legs folded, their necks extended, their eyes half closed in the way of animals enduring discomfort with patience. The people rested in whatever position was most comfortable in the available shade. Some slept. The midday sleep was genuinely refreshing if the conditions permitted. Some ate. A midday meal of dates and flatbread and whatever was available, eaten without ceremony in the heat. Some simply lay still and waited for the worst of the heat to pass. The duration of the midday rest varied by season and by the specific conditions of the day. In the very hottest months it might be 2 or 3 hours. In cooler weather it might be only 1. The rule was pragmatic. You rested until continuing was manageable, and then you continued. The midday rest was also when the caravan leader made decisions about the afternoon's route. He reviewed the mental map of the remaining day, how far to the next water source, whether the terrain ahead was better or worse than what had been covered in the morning, whether the pace needed to be adjusted. He consulted with the water guide if one was present. He made his decisions, and then the decision was communicated by voice, by movement, by the caravan leader simply standing and beginning to walk. And the caravan followed. The camels stood with grumbling reluctance. The loads were adjusted if anything had shifted. The column reformed, and the afternoon walk began. The middle hours of the day and the middle hours of the night share a quality. They are the hours that are furthest from beginnings and ends. The morning is past, the evening is still ahead, and you are in the long middle of the crossing. These middle hours require a different quality than the beginning and the ending. Not the energy of the beginning, not the relief of the ending, simply the steady continuation, the maintenance of pace, the putting of one foot in front of the other without expectation of immediate change. And this quality, the steady continuation, is what you are practicing right now. The night is in its middle hours, or its earlier hours, or wherever it is, and sleep is coming. Not dramatically, not immediately perhaps, but coming, steadily. As the destination came to the caravan mile by mile, simply coming. Good night. The way the desert smelled. The desert had a smell that was different from any other landscape. It was a dry smell primarily, the smell of aridity, of low humidity, of air that had travelled hundreds of miles without crossing water or vegetation of any density. This dryness had a specific character, clean, mineral, slightly sharp, the smell of hot stone in the sun and cool stone in the shade. Over this base was laid the specific smells of what the desert contained, the resinous, sharp smell of the sparse desert plants, the wormwood, the camel thorn, the various small shrubs that survived in the most arid conditions by being small and slow and deeply rooted. These plants released their essential oils most readily in the heat of the day, and the smell of the desert in the afternoon was partly the smell of the aromatic compounds being volatilized by the sun. After rain, and the desert did receive rain, rarely, unpredictably, and sometimes, and dramatically, the smell changed completely. The dry mineral smell was replaced by the intense petrichor of rain on dry ground, one of the most vivid smells that the natural world produced, the scent of geosmin released from the soil by the moisture. a smell that human beings recognized and responded to with a visceral pleasure that had deep evolutionary roots. The smell of rain in the desert was so vivid after long drought that it could be smelled from miles away before the rain reached you. The caravan that smelled rain approaching knew that the route ahead had received water, which was information of some importance. The smell of the desert at night was different from the daytime smell, cooler, quieter. The aromatic compounds of the desert plants not being driven off by the sun, the smell of the cooling stone, the smell of the fire smoke that had accumulated in the camp and lingered in the still night air, the smell of the camels, which was itself distinctive, a warm, slightly dusty animal smell that was the background smell of the camp, and that, for anyone who had spent a long time with camels, became the smell of the journey, the smell of the road, the smell of your own bedding after weeks in the desert was the smell of the desert worked into the fabric, the mineral dust, the camel smell, the smoke, the faint smell of your own body in the dry air. This smell was familiar, particular to this crossing, to these weeks, to this specific experience of the desert. You breathed it in, and it was the smell of where you were, as the smell of your room, wherever you are, is the smell of where you are. Particular, specific, yours. Not the desert smell, something else, something that belongs to your specific place. Breathe it in, this is where you are, this is home for now. And in the familiarity of the smell of where you are, the body settles, the breathing deepens, the eyes close. Sleep, good night. The last mile. The last mile of the day's walking was the hardest mile, not because anything about the terrain was worse than what had come before. The last mile was the same desert, the same walking. But the body knew it was the last mile, or sensed it, from the position of the sun and the established rhythm of the day's march, and the slight change in the caravan leader's pace that indicated the stopping place was near, and the body in its tiredness had been relying on the knowledge that the end was coming, and the knowledge that the end was near made the body aware of its tiredness in a way it had not been while the end was still far. The last mile revealed what all the previous miles had accumulated. You felt it in the last mile, the weight of the whole day, and then the caravan stopped, and you stopped, and the feeling of stopping after hours of walking was the feeling of the body's motion suddenly no longer required of it. The muscles that had been contracting and releasing now simply held. The body standing, and even standing was easier than walking, and then you sat, or you crouched, or you lay down if the ground permitted, and the relief was immediate and real. The last mile was hard, the stopping was good, and this is where you are now. The last mile is done. You have stopped. The relief is available. The stopping is good. Let the tiredness of the whole day, however it expresses itself in you, as tightness or restlessness, or the inability to settle, let it do what it does, which is to resolve, slowly, in the rest that follows the final stopping. The body knows what to do when you stop. It has always known. Let it do it. The last mile is behind you. The stopping is here. The rest is here. Sleep. Good night. The desert. At the end of this story, the desert that we have been describing is still there. The Sahara is still there. The Arabian desert is still there. The Taklamakan, the Gobi, the Atacama, the Namib, they are all still there, as large and as patient and as silent as they have ever been. The caravanserais that served the great trade routes are mostly ruins now. Some are restored and visited as historical monuments. Some are buried in sand. Some are simply gone, their mud brick returned to the earth from which it was made. The trade routes are no longer travelled by camel caravan mostly. The cargo moves by truck on roads, by aircraft, by container ship. The specific profession of the desert merchant on the specific routes of the medieval period is essentially gone, replaced by logistic systems of vastly greater capacity and speed. But the desert is there, and the stars above the desert are there, and the silence of the desert night is there, and the specific cold of the desert night after the specific heat of the desert day is there, and the smell of the desert after rain is there. These things have not changed. The caravan is gone, but the desert it crossed is not, and anyone who goes into the desert today finds the same desert that the medieval merchant found, the same silence, the same stars, the same reduction of life to its essentials. The desert is patient. It has been waiting for this story to end, as you have been waiting for sleep, and here it is. The end of the story, the desert still there, the stars still turning, the silence still complete. And you, having walked the full crossing in this telling, having followed the caravan from the caravanserai in the departure city to the caravanserai in the arrival city, through the sand and the heat and the cold nights and the midday rest and the oasis and the sandstorm and the stars, you have arrived. The loads are down, the camels are settled, the fire is low, and the night holds everything, gently, without urgency, in the patience of the desert. Sleep now. You have earned it. The crossing is done. Good night. One more night. In the desert. There is one more night to spend before we are done. Not because more needs to be said, exactly, but because the desert is large and the nights are long, and there is always one more stretch of quiet before the destination is reached. So let us have one more night. The camp is established in the same way as all the other camps. The loads are stacked, the camels are hobbled, the fire is lit, the tea is made and drunk, the meal is eaten, the conversation is had or not had, the fire drops to coals, and the camp sleeps. This night the sky is very clear. No clouds, no haze, the air very dry even for the desert, the stars very bright even for the desert. The Milky Way is overhead, its familiar structure, the denser core in the direction of the galactic centre, the less dense outer arm in the other direction, stretched from horizon to horizon. The constellation that the caravan navigator uses for north is steady in its place. The planets are in their positions, moved slightly from where they were last week. This slow drift of their orbits, visible to the careful observer over days. The desert is very quiet tonight. No wind, no animals, no sound except the occasional sound of a sleeping caravan. Just the stars and the silence and the cold and the darkness. This is as quiet as the world gets, and in this quiet all the caravan's travellers are sleeping. The merchant, the camel driver, the water guide, the guards, the scholar who is going to study with a distant teacher, the pilgrim who is making the crossing as part of a longer journey to a holy place. All of them sleeping, in the same cold, under the same stars, in the same silence. The individual differences that made each one specific, their religion, their purpose, their origin, their destination, are irrelevant to the sleeping. The sleeping is the same for all of them. The body needs rest. The night provides it. The desert holds them equally. You're held equally by your night. Whatever you carry, whatever you are going toward. whatever you have left behind. The night holds you equally. The sleep is the same, for the merchant and the scholar and the camel driver and the pilgrim and you. The same darkness, the same quiet, the same rest. Take it. It belongs to you. The night is yours. Sleep. Good night. The desert remembers nothing. The desert remembers nothing. The passage of 10,000 caravans over 1,000 years left no permanent mark on the desert. The footprints filled with sand. The fire pits were buried. The bones of camels that died on the route were bleached and scattered and eventually buried. The carved inscriptions that some travellers left on rocks, the names, the dates, the short messages of existence, some of these survived, but most did not. The stone weathering, the letters softening, the message fading into the general surface of the rock. The desert received the caravans and released them and returned to what it had been. This is not a sad thing. It is simply the nature of the desert. It does not accumulate. It processes. The organic becomes mineral, the temporary becomes permanent, the particular becomes general. The specific merchant on the specific route in the specific year becomes part of the long, undifferentiated passage of human commerce, and the long, undifferentiated passage of human commerce becomes part of the long, undifferentiated history of the desert, and the long, undifferentiated history of the desert becomes part of the long, undifferentiated history of the earth. This reduction, this dissolving of the specific into the general, is one of the things the desert does, and it is, in its way, a form of rest. The specific is exhausting. The merchant carrying his specific goods on his specific route for his specific profit is fully occupied with the specific. The desert, which cares about none of it, offers a brief respite from the weight of the specific. In the desert, you are not a merchant or a scholar or a pilgrim. You are a person crossing a desert. That is specific enough. All the other specifics can rest, as your specifics can rest tonight. You are not your job or your obligations or your unfinished business or your worries. You are a person who needs sleep. That is specific enough. The rest can wait. The desert holds you, and in the morning you will pick it all up again, the specifics, all of it, and carry it forward. But not tonight. Tonight the desert holds you without judgment and without memory and without requiring anything, and you can let it and sleep. Good night. The sand is still, the night is long, the stars are steady, and sleep is here. Good night.